In this video, we will see how to document the REST APIs we have developed until now as part of the series. We will be using Swagger and Springfox to automatically generate the documentation for our REST API. Before starting the video, if you want to check out the written version of this tutorial, you can check the first link in the description where you also have the link to the source code of the application. Alright, I know I told you our backend implementation part is completed for a Reddit clone application, but before starting to develop our Angular application, I thought it would be good to also show you the procedure to document the REST APIs we have developed. In that way, we can refer to the documentation whenever we need to write the logic to make REST API calls to our backend. So now let's see why we need to document our REST APIs. In the real world, you will be obviously developing a REST API so that other clients can consume it. In our case, the client is an Angular application. It's always a best practice to create documentation for our API so that the other developers can understand what they are working with. So in the real world, having this documentation is very helpful and improves the user adoption of our API. And this also makes the maintenance of the REST API very easy. Alright, now to implement this documentation in our application, we will be using an open API specification called as Swagger and a library called as Springfox, which allows us to automatically generate the documentation for our REST API by following the Swagger specification. So as a first step, open the pom.xml file and add the following Maven dependencies. The first one is Springfox Swagger 2 and the next one is Springfox Swagger UI. Both these dependencies are on the version 2.9.2 as the latest at the time of recording the video. After that, make sure that there are no errors shown inside the pom.xml. And now I'm going to create a class called as Swagger configuration inside our config folder. Inside this class, I'm going to add the configuration annotation, and here I'm going to enable Swagger in our application by adding enable Swagger 2 annotation. And inside this class, I'm going to create a bean. The name of the bean can be anything you like. So I'm going to create it as Reddit clone API. And here we are creating and returning an object called as docket. And according to the Springfox documentation, a docket is a brief statement of the contents of the document. You can configure this docket object to decide what shows up inside our Swagger documentation. For now, we will use the defaults except for the API infos. Here we are calling a method called as getAPIinfo, which returns an object of API info. Inside this method, we are providing the details of our API, which are like the title, version number, contact details, and licensing information. If you want to have a simple REST API documentation, this is a very good starting point, and this configuration should be sufficient. Now we have added the configuration class. Let's import this configuration inside our application class. I'm going to import this configuration using the @import annotation. In this way, at the application startup, Spring will invoke Springfox, and Springfox is going to scan all the REST controller components in our application and the corresponding DTOs for these REST controllers and generate the REST API documentation for all of these. Let's start up the application and check whether we are able to see the documentation or not. Once you open the browser, go to address http localhost 8080 swaggerui.html. And as you can see that we received a 403 error. So this is because Spring Security is not going to allow access to this resource because we have configured to block all the requests without the token. We have already added some exceptions to our security configuration. So we can also add the swaggerui.html and some other parts to our exclusion list. So this helps us to display the REST API documentation webpage. Once this is completed, restart the application and open the URL inside the browser. Now you can see the complete REST API documentation for our application. So you can see we have all of REST controllers which are defined inside our project here in the Swagger documentation. We can see what are the endpoints which are there in our application, including the HTTP methods they support. We can also check the models. These are the request and response classes, which are also called as DTOs. And we can also see the example values we can provide to the request payload and which data type they support. And lastly, you can also see the documentation as a raw JSON by clicking on the URL localhost 8080/v2/API docs. So that is it for this short video. In the next video, we will see how to implement the login and register functionalities in our Angular application. If you learned something from this video, please don't forget to like and share this video and also subscribe to this channel. And please don't forget to click on the bell icon to get the notification as soon as I uploaded the video. I will see you in the next video. Until then, happy coding techies and be safe.